It was a completely new way of looking at your curriculum, looking at the goals, looking at, how are they interwoven or intertwined with each other? What are the connections between the goals? But in the end, or maybe you should say it, René, but now I love it. I actually I make all these different kinds of maps. I like to do it in the evening, even of our CPD program. I love it now, but it was a hard start.
So the interesting thing is that we were watching somebody doing formative action. I did a process of formative action. And then while doing that process, I did a new process of formative action to ask in which step we were on. I said, it's like Inception, the movie.
Welcome to Rethinking Education. Education's critical friend.
Hello once again, my fathomless friends. Welcome to the Rethinking Education podcast, Education's critical friend. My name is James Mannion, and you really are very welcome indeed. A few years ago, I was contacted by a lovely man called René Kneyber, an educator and teacher trainer based in the Netherlands. René had read Fear is the Mind Killer, the book about self-regulated learning that I wrote with my dear friend Kate McAllister a few years ago, and he invited me to keynote at a conference held in Utrecht last year on the theme of self-regulated learning. René is one of the founders of an organization called Toetsrevolutie, which translates, I believe, as Test Revolution, a teacher training cooperative that specializes in formative assessment, summative assessment, and curriculum design. I have since had the great pleasure to get to know the Toetsrevolutie gang a little. I've been out to the Netherlands 3 times now, I believe, and I plan to visit again later this year. They are really lovely people, super smart, very forward-thinking, and making lots of good things happen in Dutch schools and indeed further afield. For this episode, I spoke with 2 of the founders of Toetsrevolutie, René Kneyber and Valentina Devid, 2 of the 4 authors of an excellent new book, Formative Action, the English translation of which was published by John Catt in this country last month. As many listeners and viewers will be aware, formative assessment is a very important concept in education, which was initially brought to wider attention in this country in a seminal publication, Inside the Black Box, published by Dylan William and Paul Black in 1998. Quite a while ago now, over 25 years. At heart, formative assessment is a really straightforward idea, which simply means that the teacher collects information about their pupils, which they then use to inform their future teaching practice. But as it turns out, it can be fiendishly difficult to translate this deceptively simple idea into classroom practice for a whole range of reasons. As I learned in the course of this conversation, René was the first person to introduce formative assessment in the Netherlands. But while he could immediately see the benefits of this idea in his own classroom, when he started talking about it with other people, he soon found that the language was getting in the way. It's not really about assessment. It's about the actions teachers take in response to the assessment activities that they undertake. And so he changed the name to Formative Action and created a model which overcomes many of the problems experienced previously in this field of formative assessment. The book is absolutely brilliant, concise, super clear, and practicable. And as you can see in Dutch, it's called Formatief Handelen. And in this conversation, we take a deep dive, working our way through the 5 steps of the formative action model in its entirety. Before we dive in, I should mention that if you visit the website formative-action.com, you can access a free PDF of one of the chapters of the book, as well as a free online course, which is really produced to a very high standard and I highly recommend. While we're on the subject of highly recommended online courses, I also recommend an online course on self-regulated learning made by myself, which is available to patrons of this podcast. The course looks at 3 of the big ideas in self-regulated learning: metacognition, self-regulation, and oracy, and it includes lots of practical strategies for how to put these powerful ideas into action in your own classroom, if you're a teacher, and indeed in your own life as a human being, which I presume you are if you are both listening to and understanding this podcast. Or maybe you're an alien from the future, in which case it might even be useful for you. To access this course, along with many other benefits, including a searchable transcript of this episode and every episode of the podcast to date, please visit patreon.com/repod. That's patreon.com/repod. Also, if you have not yet done so, please do leave a quick review on Apple Podcasts. I'm told it really helps, and any reviews, good or otherwise, will be read out on a future episode of the show. There's a jingle coming up in about 20 seconds. You could do it then, couldn't you? There's a link in the show notes. Just a thought. All of this said, my beautiful fellow passengers of Spaceship Earth, I will now hand over to my recent fascinating conversation with René Kneyber and Valentina Devid. I hope you enjoy the show. Cue the jingle. René Kneyber and Valentina Devid, welcome to the Rethinking Education podcast.
Good to be here. Thank you so much for inviting us.
Yes, thank you so much.
So for any listeners or viewers who are not familiar with you, could you please just briefly introduce yourselves and the work that you do? Let's go Valentina first and then René.
Well, my name is Valentina. I'm a former history teacher and also been a school leader in secondary education. And I worked briefly in higher education as well as an assessment expert. And I founded with René and Dominique Sluismans the CPD company all around formative assessment, or as we like to call it, formative action, but that later. So we train lots of teachers in the Netherlands all around formative assessment.
Great, thank you. And René?
Yeah, so I'm René Kneyber, and I'm a former mathematics teacher. I've been teaching for 16 years, and but the last couple of years I've been busy setting up CPD around formative assessment and also classroom management. And I wrote a number of books on different subjects, stuff like classroom management, but also on educational policy. And one of our latest books is the Formative Action book that's coming out at the end of April.
Indeed, and I was quite pleasantly surprised to find that you were involved in the Flip the System book that came out a few years ago.
I'm so glad you still know that book. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you mind to just mention a little bit about that? What was that book and what was it about?
Yeah, so the Flip the System book was about like the wave of neoliberal policies that you could find all across the world, and basically how that was impacting on the teacher profession. So, personally, I have a vision of teachers as being highly professional, and also the ones to be able to think about the goals that they're trying to reach and think about the ways that they want to achieve those goals. Well, what we saw is like all across the world, like we had contributions from all continents, that the teaching profession was under pressure, and we tried to find a way for teachers, to do a better job in a context that is more like healthy for teachers. And yeah, so that was especially in the UK, that was a big success, and also has been a spin-off.
There was indeed
spin-off versions, yeah, in Australia and United States and Sweden. So that's pretty awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very cool. Thank you for that. Right, so we're here mainly to talk about your book, which has just been translated into English and which is coming out. I think by the time this podcast comes out, the book will be available. Formative Action. And this is some work that you've been doing for about the last 6 or 7 years or so. Is that correct?
Well, it depends on who you're asking. Yeah.
Okay, right.
René has been doing it quite longer than I have, because he brought it to the Netherlands. He's the first person who introduced the whole concept in the Netherlands.
Ah, right. Okay. And when was that? And how did that come about, René?
Yeah, so that was in 2010, which is, I know, way later than when you guys all started doing formative assessment collectively. Yeah. So, and I don't know what happened. Like it's basically just went past us, and I was I was teaching my classes, and I was running into the situation where students just, you know, although I gave some pretty good lessons, they will still weren't, the results weren't up to scratch. So, so um, what I found is that I was looking for ways to improve on my teaching, and I came across this concept called formative assessment, which I hadn't heard about, and I started reading about it and implementing it, and I was so happy with the results of that, not only in terms of actual results, but also in what it did for my students and what it did for my teaching, is that I figured, well, I need to start telling other people about this. So I was actually one of the pioneers, and yeah, did a lot
Right.
of work to lay the ground for everybody else.
Interesting. So when I trained to teach in 2005, the like formative assessment by then was sort of known as assessment for learning in this country, and it was absolutely everywhere. I think I had something ridiculous like about 10 training sessions on assessment for learning during my 1 year of training. So it was absolutely, at its peak at that time. And so we'll get into your book shortly, but first of all, let's just take some broad strokes. Like, what is formative assessment, and how does it differ to other kinds of assessment?
Well, I actually talked about this today because I
Oh,
had a
great.
CPD
Okay.
session. I will try to translate it now in my head from Dutch to English and see if it works. Um, but I guess what we like to do, if we look at formative assessments, is not frame it as a kind of assessment, because I think already there's where the problem or the trouble starts. So we like to position it more as pedagogy, because that's the whole goal that you have with it. That's the aim. You have a pedagogical aim with this very pedagogical instrument. So um, I know about the assessment as for etc., but I find it always very hard to keep them apart. And I understand them theoretically, but I find them hard to work with in practice. So of course you have summative assessment and you have formative assessment, and summative assessment is all about high stakes, and that you want to collect data or information to make high stakes decisions about the learning of your students. So the whole goal, the whole aim of the collecting or eliciting information of your students is different than from when you are eliciting information of the students with the formative aim, because then you want to make a pedagogical decision. And I think that is the crucial difference.
Right. Would you add anything to that, René?
Yeah, so I think the whole term formative assessment has been one of the issues around the implementation. So as you said, in the UK, there's been a pretty big push around formative assessment over the years. And what we see is, when we look at the research, we see that about 25% of all teachers actually employ, up to one strategy in their classroom. So apart from the fact that there's been a lot of CPD and a lot of money has been pushed at the whole concept, the implementation hasn't really worked. But that's not necessarily a problem in UK alone. There's been this really interesting book from Linda Allal called Assessment for Learning, The Challenge of Implementation.
Yeah.
They have a lot of contributions from a lot of countries where they show that everywhere there are similar issues with trying to implement formative assessment. And one of the things is what Valentina mentioned, is that like a lot of people see formative assessment as a form of assessment. And what we did is we actually tried to, as one of the lessons we learned, is we took it totally away from that domain of assessment and put it right in the classroom where we think this whole concept belongs.
Yes, right. Dylan William has previously talked about the problem with that phrase, the fact that it includes the word assessment. And at one point he said that he would have called it responsive teaching or something, if he had his time again. And so this spun out of some work so William and Black wrote this paper in 1998 inside the Black Box, where they it was like a systematic review of the evidence on formative assessment, and they sort of made some quite bold claims about it. They sort of said like, this is the best bet that we have for improving outcomes for kids. And in the final paragraph or two of that paper, it was quite interesting because they sort of said government needs to get on board with this. Like, we need to fund this and to make it a central focus of education policy. And that is indeed what happened in this country. And that was often blamed for the reason that it turned out to be sort of so weirdly implemented, and it quite quickly underwent lots of strange, what people sometimes call lethal mutations. Like when I was training, people sort of said you need to have, lollipop sticks with all the children's names on, and that was an important part of assessment for learning. And also that the children should have traffic light cups that are red, yellow, and green that they would somehow use to communicate to me what was going on in their heads. That was never particularly clear. And none of that bore any real resemblance to what the way that Black and William defined formative assessment, which was very simply as information that the teacher collects on their students that they then use to inform their teaching, rather than, I suppose that's as opposed to just plowing on with their plan regardless of the information that they're getting from the kids. And so it's a very simple idea, right? The teachers collect information that they then use to inform their future teaching. And yet, like, setting aside the fact that the government got involved with it and made it more sort of about assessment, and people were firing up traffic light colored spreadsheets and so on. In this country, there was a big focus on the children were supposed to be able to always know exactly what level and sub-level they were at in every subject, and what they needed to do to get to the next sub-level. So it's turned into this sort of exercise in tracking and data and micromanagement of sort of children's grades. And
so that's where also the link is with the Flip the System book, of course, is that
right.
Usually when the government gets involved, they will try to do two things. Is that they want to steer heavily on the outcome and steer heavily on the input side as well. So, and I think one of the issues that you saw in the UK is actually also what we try to describe in the Flip the System book, is that if you want to, especially maybe around this theme, is that you really want to invest in the professional, like the professionalism of teachers and their capacity to change it in such a way that it makes sense in their context. But it requires a lot of thinking on the part of the teachers. So what happened here is, I guess, is that the government or anybody else who was in between started to do all the thinking for the teachers and came up with stuff like colored spreadsheets and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, but that in the end turned out to be a lethal mutation. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. And so Dylan William wrote more recently, about 5 years ago, so he wrote that had he and Paul Black known 20 years before then what was going to be involved in implementing this idea in schools, that neither of them would have had the courage for it, because it turned out to be so hard to implement, which serves well, I think, as a jumping off point. Why do you think it is that this apparently simple idea of collecting information from the kids and using that to inform your future teaching, why has this proven to be so difficult to implement, do you think? Let's go to Valentina first with that one.
I think it's, of course, the difficulties or the challenges are multiple, but one of the first things is why it's quite challenging, or why it can be hard, and that's also the title of our new book, is that it's not just an instrument. It's not just a pedagogical instrument. It's all has to do also with your curriculum design. So for you as a teacher to implement or use this strategy well, you really need a clear view, a clear picture of your curriculum build-up, of your curriculum design, because yes, it's in the end as simple as asking a question or eliciting information of your students and using it. And the using part is also quite challenging, or acting upon it. But the first problem or challenge is that you have to ask the right question, because I always struggle with the question. What I see is, let me rephrase. What I see is when teachers start implementing formative action in their classroom, is that they like to ask the question, what do you remember of our previous lesson? And that question alone is on so many levels troublesome or difficult, because what is, like, all the students can say, yeah, I remember that you were wearing white shoes, or I remember that, I went to soccer afterwards, or, so the question is not sharp enough. It's not focused enough. So you immediately see, if you ask that question and you collect the answers, like, oh man, I didn't want to know that actually. So the whole challenge or the whole problem starts with asking the right questions. And because we all are short on time, because we always feel like, the curriculum is too big, and the stuff that we have to cover is a lot. So we're having trouble to finding enough time as it is. So with the time that we have, you have to be very clear and very sharp or focused in what you want to elicit from the learning process of your students.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Would you add anything to that, René? Why is this so hard to get right, do you think?
Yeah, so I think like a common pitfall would be that you focus too heavily on the data collection. So you go like, well, I just need a lot of information. Like, I'm going to ask broad questions, and then, but you actually kind of forget or kind of lose view on the action part of it. So, and that's, what we try to do is we try to give more focus to the action, like the decision and the following action that you do, because that in a lot of ways shapes the way you have to like design your data collection process.
Sure, and so hence the realization, I suppose. You write in the book that around 2018 you decided to adopt this phrase formative action instead of formative assessment. Is it formative handelen? Is that
very good? Yes.
Your Dutch is improving. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, and so and is this around about when you started to use this idea more widely with teachers? Is it that you were starting to do this work, René, and you found that the language was getting in the way? What was the cause for you shifting the name to formative action?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about a new term, like way back, and I tried a new, like, different ways of talking about it, and nothing really stuck. And then I just had a like sort of epiphany or something. It's where I went like, well, I just want to like put all the focus on the action part. And then I came up with the term formative action, and I started using it in talks, trying it out. I designed like some first version of the model around it. And I was actually very happy with how that worked. So then I wrote a blog post, and that really caught on. And now it's like the go-to term. Like, if you're in schools, everyone's talking about formative action and not about formative assessment. So even the like the Dutch Ofsted, shall we say, also uses the term formative action in all their policy documents.
Right. Okay. That's a win then, surely. That's successful. Amazing. And so in the introduction to the book, you sort of set out that there's these three broad ideas. Number one, language matters, and we've sort of just dealt with that it's important to be clear that this is not about assessment. It's not about collecting data. It's much more about the teacher thinking really hard about their role in guiding the pupils towards some curriculum goal. Secondly, this idea that formative action is a process, and in a moment we'll work through this 5-step process. And thirdly, as you said earlier, Valentina, that it should be embedded in a coherent curriculum design so that you just have clarity about what exactly it is that you're trying to achieve here, right? Which sort of is almost, sometimes these things, it seems so obvious, but actually you sometimes need to state the obvious, don't you? Because there are basic things that are sort of being missed. And so let's dive into some concrete examples before we go through the process. At the start of the book, you highlight these 3 examples of what formative action might look like in practice. So if you think about, like, some listeners might not be teachers, there might be parents or, you know, whoever, young people listening. So for a non-teaching audience, could you sort of explain like what this might look like in practice? And you might want to draw on some or all of those 3 examples from the book.
I think I can explain it the best or give the best example by always going back to my own lesson practices and how I incorporate it in my classroom. So when you teach history, you want to know if some concepts, if students really grasp them, if they landed well. And some concepts are really difficult or really abstract. And so every subject that you teach, doesn't matter the level or what kind of education, there are always specific pitfalls. So I discovered one time, quite late actually, that my students didn't know the difference between Martin Luther King and, as we say in Dutch, Maarten Luther. So the the European version. And that is quite annoying if students, haven't got clear or haven't got it correct again, that they're 2 completely different persons in different time eras with, different skin color, etc. So that's just one example that's very funny. But there are lots of examples to think about, like typical pitfalls and difficulties that students can have in your subject. And I think those typical struggles or pitfalls are really good for a process of formative action. So you as a teacher are curious, like, okay, do my students, are they able to differentiate between that, or are they able to name the causes of the First World War? And then I let them answer on a digital tool like quizzes or Padlet or something like that. And then I see the answers and I immediately see like, ooh, they haven't got it all right, or all of them forgot like 2 very important causes. So then I immediately know or think about what should I do to repair the lack of knowledge that I then have seen that is missing. So that is, I think, what the whole concept is about, like looking for typical pitfalls or looking for very important aspects of your subject and then acting upon it.
Sure, thank you for that. That's a very rich and very sort of clear example, right? So you ask them to undertake some written exercise. What are the causes of the First World War? You analyze what they collectively know. So you're not necessarily thinking about this at an individual level. You're sort of thinking like what's happening across the whole class. Are there any just gaps in their current understanding? And you think, well, we need to go back and think about X, Y, and Z in the next lesson.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Are there any other examples that you can summon up, René?
Yeah, sure. So we have 3 examples in our book, and another example is the 3rd example in the book by a teacher trainer, and who has a group of students who are all trying to become a teacher, and then he gives them the assignment to do a 5-minute video of them explaining a concept. And then what he does is he lets them do a recording, which is like a first version. And then he has like this huge feedback round where they give each other peer feedback. They give themselves self-feedback. They set up criteria for when is this good. And they try to build like an action plan for themselves. Like, oh, this is what I'm going to improve. This is what I'm going to improve. So then in the end, they have like a plan ready, and then they execute that plan and turn it into action. Yeah, so that's also like a very nice example, because even though like the feedback takes a really long time, it's still focused on, letting students take action. So I think the interesting thing about the whole formative action, conceptualization is that you can either have teachers, or teachers and students, or students make a decision about what to do next. So that's like a very good example of how you could achieve that in a higher education setting.
Great. Okay, thank you. And so it's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because it seems pretty straightforward still. It seems like there's a goal that you're trying to achieve. The students are sort of like, some of them will be able to do it straight away, some of them not so much, and you need to figure in how to fill in the gaps and get them to where you're going. But there's deceptively simple, that understanding, isn't it? There's a lot going on under the hood. And so let's get into, so I know you've been working with Oliver Caviglioli to create this 5-step process, as like in the way that they do in the books with Tom Sherrington around the teacher and now learner walkthroughs, these sort of 5-step processes. So let's go through this process. And before we started recording, Valentina pointed out that they recently spoke about step 1 for about half an hour on a different podcast. So we'll try to
extend on that time. Yeah.
We'll try to pull out the headlines. So step 1 is orient and predict. And you start by saying that formative action is a goal-oriented process, and that the teacher therefore needs to start by doing a thorough mental orientation. So please, could you walk us through this? What does this involve? What does the teacher need to orient themselves towards in this initial sort of planning stage? Let's go to René with this one first.
So we designed this model with Oliver, and I think, like, if you look at the step 2, 3, 4, and 5, that it's not really that new, but the first one is actually quite new that you don't find anywhere else. So this is like, step 1 is like the addition that you will not find, in other books, maybe under the hood, but not as explicit as we have it. So one of the things we talked about earlier is that it's very important to collect information in order to turn it into action. But in order to do that, you have to go through a mental step, and you need to think about, what are the problems that, what information do I need? So where are we in the instruction process? Like, where do we come from? Or do we come from recently, and where are we heading? What step am I going to take, and what information do I need? So, for example, what prior knowledge do students need to have in order to fully grasp the instruction I'm going to give? And then when you think about, well, this is the prior knowledge, then you also think about what are the common pitfalls or the common misconceptions, what are the errors I'm expecting, like you do a prediction as a teacher. And all those thinking steps that you do in your own head are, fundamental to making a process of formative action work. Because if you did not think clear, don't have a clear view of the misconceptions that you're trying to find, turning information into action becomes pretty hard, because what you will then see is that, you ask your students to put their mini whiteboards in the air, and they all put them in the air, and you see like the teacher, getting scared from all the things that he's seeing on the mini whiteboards. It's like, whoa, that's way too much information. Where do I start? And when you take a step back and you go like, oh my God, what's happening? And then you can never turn all of that into like a proper action. So if you do the first step well, then what usually happens is that you recognize all the problems that you see on the mini whiteboard, and you've already prepared for the solution in advance. So that's something that might work. But sometimes, of course, you make a wrong prediction, which is also interesting. Like, what can happen is that you make a prediction and they put all their mini whiteboards in the air, and you go like, oh, well, I hadn't expected that. So then you need to take a step back. But, and in a way, that's very interesting, because usually when we speak about formative assessment or formative action, we think about it as, improving the learning process of students. But it's actually quite a good tool to improve the learning process of the teachers as well, because especially when you make predictions and they don't come true, then that's actually, beneficial for your own learning as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you know, that's really made me remember something, what you just said about the 30 mini whiteboards and being overwhelmed by that level of information. It makes me think back to like whenever we would be observed in those sort of early years of my teaching career, when assessment for learning was like the thing.
And there would be this sort of almost like performative element where, like, for the benefit of the observer, you'd ask the kids to all hold up their mini whiteboards, and then you'd sort of take a moment and like really make it look like you were taking in all of this information and somehow, you know, using it to formulate a master plan as to what to do next. And actually, you're just thinking like, oh, that kid, I can't really read that, and they've just written in some simple color of ink and you whatever. Yeah, it's really interesting. So I wonder if we can sort of hang this off the example that you offered earlier, Valentina, the causes of World War One thing, or maybe you could pull in some wider examples from history. So can you think about like what might that look like in this sort of planning and orientation phase? What kinds of things would you be thinking about?
Well, in how we teach history in the Netherlands, we find it really important that in all the books that the students know the main causes of the First World War, and they have to recognize them. They have to be able to formulate them. They have to be able to recognize them in like pictures or a text about the First World War. And so I would be thinking like in step one, where am I in my lesson series? Where am I? And what are my goals? And what do I want them to know now? What do I expect that they know at this moment? And then let's say like, okay, I've taught the causes of the First World War, and now I want to investigate, like, are they able to formulate them themselves? Are they able to formulate the 5 main causes? Because I want them to know, I want them to be able to formulate it for themselves without help, because it's that important. So that is all my orientation part. And then I would have to think about what kind of question do I also want to ask, and what kind of instrument do I want to use later on in like step 2, etc. So I would think like maybe the question is good to just ask them, can you name the 5 main causes of the First World War? I think I'm then on the right track. And then my prediction could be like, I think they will know like 3 of the 5 main causes, but I think they will forget, you know, the 4th or the 5th, or they will maybe be vague about some of them, or, you know, all kinds of different predictions that you can make, differs from also class to class. So that is my thinking in step 1. And also what I have to think about, and that's a really interesting and fascinating and very hard one as well, is when is it good enough? So later on in step 3, when I'm, you know, really collecting or interpreting also the information, I have to make a decision quite quickly, or I have to be able to make quite quickly a decision of how to move forward. So if I start my thinking, well, while being overwhelmed with the mini whiteboards or the Padlet, or, you know, or the answers on Padlet, it's too late already. And believe me, I've done this in the beginning. So it's way better or way easier to think in front, like, okay, if I'm going to ask this question, and I think my prediction will be that they will answer this and this and that, when will it be good enough? What kind of percentage, what kind of types of answers do I actually want to see? And how will that influence the decision that I'm going to make in the lesson?
Yeah, I love that. And I think we're going to come on to that shortly, because in chapter 2 of the book, you talk about the importance of quality and just having a very clear idea about what good looks like. And is this literally just like 5 hastily scribbled bullet points, like the 5 causes of World War One, or do they need to write an essay talking about how these 5 factors interact, and that they're able to construct a historical narrative or whatever it might be? And so on the other side of this, so this step 1 is called orient and predict, and you talked about the orientation piece there, and then on the prediction side, you were talking about mainly sort of predicting what are the likely problems, what are the barriers, what do students struggle with regard to this, what misconceptions might arise. Is that something that you think you would have to be an experienced teacher to be able to do, so that you've been around the block a few times, you've taught this unit a few times, and you know about the common misconceptions that come up. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, so when we work with like teachers or teachers in training, for example, that haven't had that much experience, they find it very hard to make predictions, but it also can be hard when you have to teach in a different setting. So in Holland, we have a lot of tracks with very different programs in secondary education. So I used to teach the vocational track, and then I went to the more like theoretical tracks to teach a few years there as well. But when I started teaching there, I really didn't know what problems to expect. And, you know, so I had a ton of experience in vocational, but not in the theoretical. And even though these kids were smarter, they were also like, they still had issues, but they had issues at other points. So so what I used to do then is I would teach a lesson, and then I would use an exit ticket to see how they were making progress towards a certain goal. And then I would go through them to find out what kind of misconceptions I hadn't predicted, but it gave me the time, because it was in between lessons, to actually think about what the proper follow-up action should be. So when you're teaching in like a new situation, you can use formative action, you know, to find out what you don't know yet as a teacher, which is like a very interesting way to do it. But it's very hard to do formative action on the fly. So it would be very hard for me to do formative action in a classroom and then immediately respond to the things I was seeing, because it was new to me as well. So, and when you have like more experience and you've taught like a unit or a class like a number of years, then it will be way easier to know in advance what will happen, and everything will just be smoother and faster and more effective, I think. So so that's what you're saying is true. Yeah.
Right.
But then,
Go on.
of course, you can also use like more experienced colleagues, because sometimes they are really, you know, trained in the typical misconceptions that students can have. So I always also like to inspire or stimulate teachers if they're quite new to teaching, like, okay, maybe this is a good opportunity to ask a more experienced colleague about what are the typical misconceptions that students will have when you teach this or that. And that can actually also be a really nice CPD without any expert being there. So I like that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings me on to my next question, actually, which was about sort of like, how does this happen? And when does it happen? You were saying that like this step one has sort of largely been missing from previous discussions of formative assessment. So you're suggesting that teachers spend some time, that they allocate some time in their day to orienting and predicting this sort of, you know, this process. Is this something that you think happens in the, like, this is not just planning a lesson for the next day. So this is sort of thinking about a whole sequence of lessons. Is this something that you advocate that teachers do together? Because like, I'm a big fan of dialogue, and I think that like some of these questions would be harder to answer by yourself, thinking about, you know, what do I want to achieve with my students? You sort of just think, well, I want them to learn and pass the test, right? You sort of think like quite a basic level. You don't really, it's harder to think hard about something when it's just yourself. So my question is sort of like, is partly about when do you expect, or when do you recommend that teachers spend some time engaged in this? And is this something that you talk about as something that happens within the mind of individual teachers, or is this like a collegiate approach? Let's go to, go on, Valentina.
I'm sorry. I can't keep it in. I think it can be both, though. So I actually worked a lot with a colleague at my former school, who's now still a colleague, but then with our CPD company, and together we planned out a lesson series, and together we also planned some of the processes of formative action. So we actually together we talked through, and we also pinpointed, like in the whole lesson series, what are very specific moments that we want to elicit information of our students, and why. So why is this really important? Why is this prerequisite knowledge so essential? Why is it that if they don't grasp this or that concept, they cannot, move on, or we cannot move on to the next concepts or skills. So I think it's way easier if you work together on this, but sometimes it's not possible. So I also did this a lot on my own. And in the beginning, you really need to take your time and plan it all out and really think about it really well. And also like in preparation of your lesson, so in front of lessons. But after a while, you get it so the whole process becomes so automated. You don't have to think about it so, specifically anymore, so consciously. So lots of the times I was in my lesson, I was teaching, and then I thought, oh, they actually need to know, or, this and this and that is a really important concept. I have to ask them that. So then, the whole step one was like a split second of thinking on my part. And then I said, okay, guys, get your pencil and your paper and write down what are the, and so in the beginning, I really think it's important to really be thinking it through and really specific about it. But after you become better at it, it's not necessary anymore.
Okay, that's great. So it's over time it becomes more sort of intuitive and less like I'm going to sit down and like set a timer and be like, right, I'm going to spend 10 minutes just thinking about this, right?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it's like one of the big questions for me is when I started in 2010, it's like I immediately grasped how you could do it. Like, oh, this is how it works. And I made it work in my classroom. And when I gave workshops to like 3 or 4 people that were also interested, those people immediately caught on to the idea and then started doing it in their lessons. But what I found out is when I went to schools and I talked to like huge rooms of people, like 100 people, is that usually they said, well, this sounds like a really good idea, but how do I start? And I was always flabbergasted by this. Like, how can you not see how to start? Because it's easy. Like you collect information and you do something with it, like, as you said. And then
what's the problem?
What's the problem? But then I sort of like, but I was really interested, like what's going on. And then what I found out eventually is that those teachers don't do that design process in their head. Like I and many other teachers have like this huge framework in their head of like, this is how everything's built up. This is prior knowledge to this. These are common misconceptions. This is what I'm trying to address or achieve. And then if you don't ask those questions, you really need help in asking those questions. So what we try to do in the book and also with the model is trying to make like the thinking of an expert very explicit. Like these are the steps you have to take, like all the 5 steps, and these are what these steps entail. And also we have this design process at the end of the book, which really goes through like, what is the main goal of this entire unit? And then really take it back towards the classroom level. But I think in the end is when you are familiar with all the steps and you've done it a couple of times, you really start, and you don't have to talk to your colleagues that much about it. But then you start internalizing it, and it becomes like a habit that you're, trying to achieve. And I've heard from an expert that habit forming is actually quite important for implementation success.
Indeed it is. Indeed it is. I must look up who this expert is. They sound absolutely fascinating. I was like, to know more.
A brilliant fellow, yeah.
Okay, so let's go to step 2. Think and generate, or just generate something, as you put it in the book, where the students are encouraged to essentially like create something, like create some output, some data, right? This is the bit where they provide data to you. Could you please elaborate on what this might look like? Let's go back to the causes of World War I. So it might be that your end goal is like this beautifully written essay, but like, initially the initial output wouldn't be that. So what would you be looking for in the generate something phase early on?
Yeah, well, also in Dutch history lessons, we ask a lot of open-ended questions, and also a lot of I don't know this is so specific, I don't know this in English, but they have like an image or like a source. They have or a picture, and then the question could be like, what kind of causes of or what cause of the First World War do you recognize in this image? And then the student has to answer and be, able to formulate it correctly and argument his answer. So what I could do is, because also in history, it's important that they give open answers to open-ended questions. But I think also why I say this is that you have to think, what kind of subject do I teach? What type of question do I want to ask? And what kind of tool matches that? So we always say also in our CPDs that the tool is not the main thing here. The tool is not the main objective, and it's definitely not a guarantee for success. So the tools should, serve the purpose. So if it can be digital tool, but it's definitely not necessary. So you can easily do it just on a piece of paper and, collect the pieces of paper or, walk around in the classroom. So in the end, the main goal here or the main criteria here is that all students need to think. So you have to make sure that in your questioning and in your how you're going to organize it in the classroom, that all your students have to think, and all of your students have to generate a production, an answer. So in my case, I would choose Padlet because I like that tool. I find it easy to work with, and I don't have to deal with handwriting. I'm not very good with reading handwriting of students. It takes me lots of time, and it gets me off of my flow also. So I like it that it's digital, and I make that work with my students, and then I can ask like one open-ended question, and they get like 2 or 3 minutes to answer. And again, routines are very important. So also don't make yourself go crazy. Like think that every lesson you have to use a different tool. That's nonsense. You can just keep on using the same tool, whatever serves you best. So that is really important here, that you also want to use the testing effect, because the testing effect is also a very effective learning strategy. And the testing effect, of course, is that students have to try to remember information from the long-term memory to their working memory. So what we also say in our CPDs, that in step 2, all students by themselves have to remember information from their long-term memory to the working memory. So no talking, no working together. That comes later.
Sure. Okay. And thinking back to the orient phase. So let's say you've oriented and you've thought that there are sort of 5 steps in your progress towards them being able to write this essay. And so you'll be asking them to generate stuff at each of these stages whenever you think that they're ready to take to the next level, so that you're taking this very quick snapshot. And you were talking, it says also here about that, you asked the question, what's the easiest and fastest way to gain an answer of everything that the students generate? So you're not necessarily talking about some, like you used the word instrument there, like, so you talked about Padlet. So it doesn't have to be some sort of big formalized process. It's just like something that's a quick snapshot. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. We really like the whole concept of being quite fluently, quite quick, quite easy to do, because again, we don't have lots of time, and we don't want it to be a formalized, testing assessment stuff. You don't want to have all that character. You want it to be a pedagogical process. So snapshot of the learning process of your students, be able to quickly interpret the information, and also be able to quickly decide how you're going to organize a follow-up action.
Right. Got you. Thank you. Do you have anything to add, René, on this generate something step?
No, yeah. So I think one of the more interesting things about this step is that what usually goes wrong is what Valentina mentioned, is that students will sometimes be afraid to show their thought process. So, this part is actually like the fastest part of the whole thing, but it's also like the most vulnerable. because one of the things that might happen is that students just don't want to make mistakes, and they don't want to show you their mistakes. They don't want to show their mistakes to anyone else. So one of the things that we really try to convey to teachers is that, you know, you shouldn't have like this logbook of all the mistakes your students made. Like you don't have to, you know, do an administration of everything that went wrong, because in the end that will work against you, because students will know, well, you're keeping a record of everything I did wrong, and you might use that against me later. And sometimes teachers even use that against them later. So they'll be right, you know, and that's really like shooting yourself in the foot, because, you know, it's like then afterwards they will never show you any of their mistakes again. So you really want to foster a culture in your classroom where students really are not afraid to show you their mistakes and to discuss the mistakes that they made. So it's, you know, in part it's about the testing effect and about thinking for yourself, but it's also about, you know, having the courage to show that you might be wrong as a student, in order to help you as a teacher or to help themselves make better decisions about what to do next.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. It's really interesting. All right, let's go on to step 3, which is interpret, communicate, and decide. So the students have generated all of this stuff. Let's go back to the Padlets. They've all come up with these different interpretations. You shared a picture of the First World War, and they've talked, and there's a range of answers, shall we say? Some of them more, you know, correct than others. And so, what does this step involve? Interpreting, communicating, deciding what to do next.
Yeah, what we also like in the model, how Oliver Cavalioglu made it, is that step 3 goes a bit upwards. It's like you go above the information, you look from, you know, you look down. So it's really a moment, also a bit of reflection, of making sense of all the information that you just elicited. So this is the part where you as a teacher, but also the students, try to make sense of what you see here. You know, what do these answers tell me? So it's important again that this process has be done quickly. So again, with the tool that you choose, it should be easily, you know, accessible, all the different answers. And then you see like, hey, maybe 2 of the 5 causes are missing. Not all of my students are naming those 2 causes, and I find it really important that they name all of them. So I need to do something with that. Or one cause is formulated quite wrongly with lots of students. They are, you know, being vague about it, and I'm not satisfied with that. I want it to be quite specific, or there's a very important concept or word missing that I was really looking for in like cause number 2. Those kinds of thoughts is what I have when I look at those answers. And then I'm like, okay, maybe I need to clarify something more. So I ask my students like, and I named them like, okay, Dave, can you explain why you wrote down this and that answer? Can you elaborate? And then he will elaborate, and ask another student to also clarify maybe his or her answer. And so this is also the time, this is the place where you communicate about the answers. And you can also ask your students to give each other feedback. So lots of times I will ask like, okay, you have like 2 minutes now, discuss with your neighbor the answers that you both gave. Maybe you can come up with like the best answer, or you can choose what from all the different answers that were on the Padlet, what was the best answer? Who in the classroom gave the best answer? So there are lots of ways how you can you know, bring this step 3 to life, and somebody has to decide. So I think in the beginning that it's important that you as a teacher decide how to move on, because if you as a teacher are not in control of the whole concept of the 5 steps, I think it's really ambitious if you let students decide already for themselves how to move on. So I really like a whole more scaffold approach here. So when you're learning this as a teacher, when you're getting a grasp on this, it's better that you decide because you are still responsible for the learning process. But maybe if you get a hang of it, then of course it can be really interesting to let your students decide, like, what do you think that is a good informed follow-up action? And you can leave that all open, but you can also say like, okay, I have 3 options here. You can choose whatever informed follow-up action you think is best applicable for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Let's come back to that thing about the students deciding, because that will tie into what I want to talk about later about the relationship between formative action and self-regulated learning. But again, I'm sort of wondering about, like, so when is this bit happening? Would you it seems like, again, you're sort of saying like ideally this stuff is very fluid and loose and it's sort of on the fly, but even just to read 30 Padlet responses in the middle of a lesson, like, okay, hang on a minute, kids, just give me 10 minutes. So again, is this something that you think would be more happening like after school, essentially, where the teachers are reflecting on the information, essentially like a little action research project? They've collected data on what the kids' current state of understanding is, and they're formulating next steps. Is that fair to say that this is a fairly formalized process rather than something that happens?
I think it can be both, actually. So when I started doing this, the informal one was way too hard. I got to that part like after 2 years, I guess. But in the beginning, because I was so overwhelmed with all the answers, I did like step 2 at the end of the lessons, always. So like in the last 10 minutes, I collected answers of my students, of their learning. And that was the easiest moment for me, because then when all my 30 students were gone, I had the time, space, and quiet to really, quietly interpret the information and think about, okay, what would I decide and how do I organize step 4 and step 5? But after a while, you get so, the whole process gets so internalized. And also, again, your predictions become really good and you're not so surprised anymore. Then it is very easy to do on the fly all the time. And it can become also very, very fluid, very, very easy to do in the classroom with all your 30 students in front of you. I actually do this. I do formative action on formative action with teachers, and it works perfectly because now my new subject is teaching formative action, and I know like the typical pitfalls and typical problems that teachers have. So, and it works wonderfully. I never know what they will answer, but I will always, are able to really quickly interpret the information and decide how to move on.
I love it when things go meta. So do you do that? Did you do that transparently with the teachers that you're working with? You sort of say, "I'm in step 3 now. I'm reviewing."
Yes, I do. I did it this morning actually, and it works every time because it's so nice to do the parallel process, and also actually you're also modeling at the same time. So you're modeling the whole all the steps and talking them through, and at the same time they're in the participant role, so they're the student and experiencing that role. So I love it. Yeah.
Just last week I was showing teachers a video of a teacher doing formative action, and then that was part of a process of formative action we were going through. So we watched the video and I collected answers, and then I asked them, okay, stop it, everybody, we're right in the middle of a process of formative action. In what step are we right now? And then everybody was like, what's happening? And then they had to vote which step they were in. And then it showed me like their understanding a little bit of if they could identify when they were going through in what step they were. And then I said, well, so the interesting thing is that we were watching somebody doing formative action. I did a process of formative action. And then while doing that process, I did a new process of formative action to ask in which step we were on. I said it's like Inception, the movie.
Love it. Were
and
you
people
in
were
step
crying,
3?
and
would you say that you were in step 3 when you were asking them to comment on that video?
Yeah. So step 2 is that they were reacting to it. And then when we were discussing it,
Yeah,
interpreting and discussing it,
good.
and I was coming towards a decision about what to do next. So I said, we are on the brink of step 4. We're still in step 3. Yeah.
That's good. That means that I'm following the plot of Inception still.
Yeah. Yeah.
More than I can say for the movie.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So that's step 3: interpret, communicate, and decide. And it seems like it's quite contingent on step 1. Like if you did a really good job in step 1, step 3 should be pretty straightforward because you've anticipated the misconceptions and what have you that might arise, and you've already got a plan in place for how to respond to that.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what I wanted to add to that was what Valentina said, is that when you work on a more complex skill, like for example, the causes of the First World War, and and they have to write things down, and it becomes more wordy and more complex, then you really have to engage your students to help you make a good decision, or you help your students make a decision on what to do. Because if they're like, their output varies a lot, you can't decide for all your 30 students on what to do, but they can make a decision for themselves on what to do. So usually when things get more complex, you need more help from your students. And that's, for example, where developing a sense for quality comes in. But that's something that we'll probably going to discuss later.
Yes, let's get to that. All right, so step 4, we're doing all right, I think.
Yeah.
I wouldn't call it pacey, but we've not got stuck for half an hour in step 1. So step 4 is informed follow-up action. So you've decided what action you're going to take, and now you actually need to do it. So let's go back to our First World War example.
Yeah.
Can you pick up the thread from there?
Yeah. So if probably I will be like half satisfied with the answers that students gave. So let's say that again, like 2 main causes are missing, then I'm very unsatisfied with that part. So that already informs me or helps me decide, okay, I need to do something with that. So I can do in step 4, I can explain it again, I can reteach, but I could also say, we're going to watch a movie and you have to see if all the 5 causes of the main First World War, if you can recognize them and write them down. I could also say, okay, read the textbook again, or make a summary, or, whatever I find that is best. Or we need to practice more, or we can make flashcards and also, learn the causes of the 5 causes of the First World War better from our heads, automatically. So in the end, you can be really creative here, and it doesn't really matter as long as it's logical for you, and a logical repair or a logical follow-up action of the stuff that you just have concluded that was happening in step 2 and 3. So I would probably do some reteaching and maybe also some practicing, because I want them to really be able to remember and formulate the 5 causes of the First World War. So that's it.
What I've seen you do before or tell about is that you also sometimes ask your students to revise their answers. Yeah. Like, we've had this discussion, we've looked at all the other answers. Now, how would you revise your own answer, or what tip would you give someone else?
Yeah.
On what to revise, and then let them revise their own work.
I love that one, because that's where they're learning from each other. That's such a huge part of teaching self-regulated learning, is that some kids have got really effective learning strategies, others not so much, but like enabling that conversation to take place about, what they do when they're asked that question. How do they organize their thinking? How do they structure an essay or whatever it might be? And then in that moment, there's a huge, often overlooked opportunity for the kids to learn from one another. And then to say, as you say, right, now revise your question based on what you've just heard.
Yeah, to add to that as well, I didn't want to make it too complex, but what I really like to do is that in step 3, when you look at all the answers of the students, is to ask the question, which all the answers that you see on the Padlet do you think is best? And give like students 2-3 minutes to look at all the answers. And in Padlet, you have like the option that you can give a heart on the answer on the post. And then after 2 minutes, like 2 or 3 posts would have like lots of hearts on there. And then I would have this wonderful conversation about quality. Like, why is this answer then, good? What can we decide, like, what are the ingredients? What are the building blocks of this answer? And also that conversation, that dialogue that you have then helps in step 4 in revising your answer. Like, okay, we discussed now why we think those answers are pretty good and what the building blocks are of building a good answer to an open-ended question. And now you do it yourself. So that's what I really like to do as well. And it really works good.
I love that. It reminds me of how, like in surveys, I often like to sort of mix up like a quantitative question, like, rate this thing on a scale of 1 to 5, whatever it is. And so you ask people to commit to a very easy, thing like give this a love heart or not a love heart. And then you say, why did you give that? Why did you give it that love heart? And then they have to unpack their thinking into why they did this very simple thing. And it's a really good way to see what's going on under the hood, as it were. Love it. And so, so in this point, you say the specifics of this step are not important, as you said, Valentina. The key point is the information retrieved in step 3 must be used, or else the reflection undertaken has been for nothing. Lovely. Right. Step 5, verify, reflect, and predict.
This step I did the least in my beginning years. I'm so sorry. I was really bad at step 5, but actually that's not uncommon. So lots of teachers struggle with step 5, but step 5 is actually so important. So it was also a pity that I didn't I took all the opportunities that were there in the beginning. But step 5 is the place. Actually, step 5 is also really difficult, but because lots of stuff happens at the same time now. So in step 5, you want to verify what you did in step 4. So let's say we did revising our answer, or I did some reteaching, or we did some more practicing. Did it really help? And what I thought for quite a long time was, okay, guys, I taught you this again. Now you got it, right? I was so convinced that what I did it was very naive of me. I thought that what I did in step 4 would of course be good enough, would be, good for all my students, that they should get it now. But yeah, that was pretty naive. So then in step 5, you want to make sure that the goal that you were working towards is being met, is being reached. So you have to do a mirror question, as we call it. So you did, like, in step 2, you asked, okay, do you know the 5 causes of the First World War? And now I have to do a similar question. So maybe I do a historical source question now and ask again, like, which kind of causes of the First World War do you recognize in this source? Or what I could also do is I would do step 5 in the next lesson. So then they will have some forgetting time. And then the next lesson, I will ask again, okay, guys, do you remember the 5 causes of the First World War? Because I want them to be able to remember them from their long-term memory. So that's also an option. And you also want to reflect on the process that you just went through with your students, because in that way they will attribute the whole process also in the right way. That's not just, luck or something, or I don't know. So that's also important for the self-regulation skills, is the reflecting and looking back. And also, again, maybe doing a new prediction, already looking forward, like, because sometimes you can be unsatisfied with the answer still. And that's not very, how do you say, a conclusion that you want to make, but sometimes it is that way anyway. So then you have to look forward towards, okay, maybe I have to do a new process of formative action.
Interesting. It seems that there's a certain amount of humility in this step, right? That there's sort of recognizing that, like, I think that we've sort of always known this for a long time, that like what is taught is not the same as what is learned. Otherwise, every kid would get 100% on every test, right? And sort of like reflecting on that, and then recognizing essentially that the corrective action that you've just taken on, you know, this wasn't going well, you've taken some corrective action, but actually maybe that also hasn't really worked very well, and so you're continually sort of circling around and just being quite, so there's a certain amount of like intellectual curiosity, would you say, that goes hand in hand with this? It's just like, oh, this is really interesting. I wonder what's happening now in the minds of these students, and will they remember this a week or a month from now? And if not, what should I do about that? Interesting. Do you have anything to add on this, on step 5, René?
Yeah, I think step 5 is also very useful for creating like self-efficacy in your students. So, you know, one of the things that happens is, for example, if you're a student and you didn't know the 5 causes of World War I, in step 2, like Valentina will have asked you, what are the 5 causes? And you didn't know all of them. You might feel a bit like, oh, I didn't know them, so stupid. And then what happens is that you then take, you have a discussion, you have a follow-up action. And if you are then able to do it, then that really boosts your confidence. Like, and you know, like you sort of see, we did this and then I was able to do it. That really, like, you know, it boosts your confidence in a way that it builds your motivation to keep trying, even though later on things might get harder, you know, but you've experienced that you were able to do it after not being able to do it, which I think is a very important experience for students.
Yeah, right. I can see that. Yeah, absolutely. And so that neatly actually brings us into the next piece that I wanted to ask you about, which is about the advantages. Why should we do this formative action process? You mentioned one there, that it develops self-efficacy among students because they can see that they can now do stuff that they couldn't do before. What other reasons are there for teachers to get on board with this? Why should we be doing this?
Well, in our first chapter, we have a lot of lists, and there are 5 advantages to using formative action. So I think the first one is that you use it to adapt to student needs. Like, in order to do so, you must see what their needs are, and formative action is a way to actually do that. Like the second thing would be to increase their motivation, for example, through for their self-efficacy. But, you know, there are also other ways, you know, if it's more goal-oriented, if your lessons are more goal-oriented, students also become more motivated. So there's like a lot of ways in which that works. Some teachers use it to deepen understanding or get better results or more cognitive results. But sometimes it's also like the reason that people mention using formative action is just to improve their self-regulated learning. Like, they're not independent enough, and I want them to become more independent. So like the final thing is, but I think that, you know, it's a very Dutch thing, I think, although I could see it working in a similar way in other contexts. But like in Holland, people get a lot of tests and a lot of grades, and most schools choose to use formative action as a sort of antidote to grading too much. But we sort of translate that into more constructive alignment. So what you're trying to do by using formative action is you try to better align goals, assessment, and lesson activities. You know, and it's like something you can do in advance. So you can think in advance about the constructive alignment of your program. Well, what you do when you're using formative action is you try to even better shape that alignment, because you're better checking where they are towards certain goals, and especially which lesson activities are appropriate for where your students are at that moment.
Right. Yeah, thank you. And so I mean, as I've been listening to this, part of me, I sometimes have these different voices on my shoulders of like different types of listeners. And I wonder whether somebody might be thinking, this just sounds like good teaching. You know, it's like the whole framework just seems like good teaching, that you teach stuff and then you check if the kids have known it and you fill in gaps. Is that would that be a fair thing to say? Do you think that that is,
Well, it's not. Well, the whole thing is not teaching entirely. So I think one of the most interesting things about formative action is that you can use it regardless of the context that you're teaching in. So whether you're like really traditional or progressive, if you're really into direct instruction or more like project-based learning, or you can use formative action to do a better job at what you're doing. So it's a very neutral thing that you add to your pedagogy and you add to the education that you're trying to set up. So in a way, it's like what you expect of a good teacher, like that you can't continuously check where your students are, or you're trying to engage your students, to see where they are and to do something with that information. But in itself, it's not good teaching yet. Like you always have to add like your own pedagogy to it, or your own approach and your own goals. And I also believe in a way that if you're an experienced teacher and you don't use anything like formative action, your lessons could still be good. It's not, we're not necessarily saying that every teacher needs to do this, but we feel that in a lot of ways that this could add to what you are already be doing. And if you're an experienced teacher, you and your students can have a lot of benefits from it, even though you're already doing a really good job. So I wouldn't say necessarily that you're not a good teacher if you're not using formative action, but even if you're a good teacher, you could improve yourself by using formative action.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. That also reminds me of something that Ron Berger said, which brings us on to our next topic again, which is about the importance of quality. We mentioned it briefly earlier, and he sort of said, like it doesn't really matter if you're progressive or traditionalist. If you're aiming for like high quality work, then I want my kid to be in that classroom. So let's talk about this. Chapter 2 of the book is about developing a sense for quality. And you start by saying formative action is a process of co-regulation to ensure, which is interesting. I'd like to expand on that, if you will, in a moment. Formative action is a process of co-regulation to ensure a more active role for students within this process. It's necessary that they develop an understanding of the expected quality of their work. Discuss.
Yeah, so this is what we call like the forgotten strategy. So what we usually do is like nobody is against using goals and nobody's against making goals clear for students. But what we usually don't really do is really convey to our students what those goals look like, and to really give them a sense for quality, as we call it. So I think that this is like also one of the things that I really didn't really do, because I taught mathematics, and then you have like you don't really have quality. It's like you have the good answer or you have a wrong answer, and there's like nothing in between. So I never really used it. But when you teach like a language or you teach like history and they have to give answers like set up in a certain way, then it becomes really important that your students like have your view on what quality is. So that's in the book, we also refer to it as like a shared sense for quality. So and the basic premise is that if you have a sense for quality, then you are better able to self-navigate towards reaching a goal. So as a student, you will ask less questions. You will do better things. You will have a higher quality standard for delivering what you're doing. And that's what I really loved about Ron Berger, his comments, and also the stuff that he wrote about, is that he said, well, if you've experienced like doing high quality work once, you never want to do something else again. And that's also what we see as when students really know, oh, this is what high quality looks like and I can achieve it. That really motivates them to do it. So that's like the first thing. And the second thing is that if you want to employ organizing feedback in your lessons, then it's really necessary that you have a shared sense for quality, so that as students, you're talking about the same things, you know, when you're talking about quality. And the basic way to achieve that is just by showing them exemplars and then discussing them with them and setting up criteria. So what usually happens in schools is that you have a learning goal, and then they have criteria, and they're just given to students, like, these are the criteria, or this is like a rubric with a lot of text in it. And now you know what the goal is. But what you actually have to add to it is just taking 2 exemplars that are either good or bad, or contrasted, and then discuss with the students. And the best thing is, but maybe that's just typically Dutch, I'm not really sure, is that you set up the criteria with your students. Like, so they have like co-developed the criteria with you, and to also give them a sense of ownership over what they're trying to achieve.
Love that. And I don't know if it is only a Dutch thing, but it's certainly something that I don't see enough of, that goals and success criteria are so often imposed from above, and therefore they just sort of are dead. They're not owned by the kids. And I think there's quite a bit, I've not looked into this for a while, but the research around goal setting is that self-set goals are just a lot more likely to be met because people have had some say in it. Do you want to come in there, Valentina?
Yeah, what's also really interesting is that in our CPD programs, at the end of the year, we ask our teachers to reflect on the whole program. And what is so fascinating is that this forgotten strategy of developing a sense for quality is actually the most popular one. So teachers in the beginning are sometimes a bit like skeptical, like, you want me to show them how the work should look like in the end, and they won't copy it, or what would I do when they copy it? You know, all those obstacles and stuff are being thrown in the way. And then, okay, you know, they complain and a bit and are being skeptical, and then they try it out, and they come back next session to you, like, you know, the sun is shining and the rainbows are. They say, "Oh my God, this strategy, I love this. I don't know why I haven't done this sooner. It's amazing that the students show better work. The questions that they will ask are from better quality. The feedback now also works better because the whole, you know, the goals are so much more clear, and how good work and how it really looks like, and what good works really look like." And so I find it so fascinating that teachers become so enthusiastic about it, that this strategy is so simple to really organize. It doesn't take you that much time. The hardest part for you as a teacher is thinking about the exemplars. What am I going to show, and where do I want to focus the thinking processes of my students? Because that's also what you do with the exemplar. So you really have to think like, okay, what do my students are always struggle with, and when they're going to write an essay, or, you know, if they're going to do a research paper, what are the typical pitfalls? Okay, make sure that the pitfalls you put also in an example, because then you can focus the thinking also of your students. But it's really, I cannot emphasize enough how awesome this strategy is.
I agree. It was really reminded me of when I had where I recorded my conversation with Ron Berger, and I was just kicking myself that I hadn't read his book, which was around, he wrote it in like the early 2000s, An Ethic of Excellence. I really wish that I had had that copy when I was training to teach, because it is everything. Like you can just see it so clearly when you see it in action. And when you see what the extraordinary things that young people are capable of doing when you lift the lid off you know, your expectations. And so there are 3 things in this chapter that you talk about as a way to establish this sense of shared quality, a shared sense of quality. Exemplars, and you talked about that a bit already, René. Dialogue and rubrics. I was just wondering if we could just spend a moment thinking about the role of dialogue here. What's the importance of dialogue in establishing this shared sense of quality, and what might that look like?
Yeah. So I think what happens is this, is that you look at exemplars and then you have to formulate why you think that's good. So and that's like a very important step, is that you look at quality and you have to think about what makes this good to me, or what does it make it look bad for me. And then that's like the one important part. But the second important part is that you talk to other people about what you think quality looks like, and then you hear perspectives from someone else that you hadn't thought of. And what sometimes will happen is that even if you have a good contrasting exemplar, you'll say, well, that one's really good, and somebody else will say the other one's really good, and you get like an entirely different point of view, and that helps you better understand how people look at quality. So in a way, it's also, to me, like a very democratic process, is where you try to find ways to co-construct criteria of what good is, and then you learn a lot about other human beings as well. And that also happens during PD, for example, as when we give them two stories that are supposed to be scary, and then a lot of people will choose version A and others will have version B, and then they'll look at each other like, why did you choose the other one? Because it's obviously worse. And then they'll have this entire discussion and better understand each other's perspective. And you can really bring that to the process of then writing a scary story, because well, some people like this, but other people would like this. And then, that really helps you towards your end product.
Yeah. And so often, thinking back on my own time as a teacher, so often it was just a sense of sort of coverage. It was just like, you just have to cover all of this stuff before the exam, and the sense of quality was just nowhere to be seen. I can see that it's why you would call it the forgotten, what was it? With the forgotten strategy, right? It's hard to do when there's so much stuff to cover. But I think it's important. It's a really important part of the puzzle, for sure. And I would love to spend longer on that, because it's like I think you said earlier, Valentina, that we could spend a whole episode just on that. Chapter 3 is feedback that leads to independence. And here we enter into territory that I'm very interested in. And you mentioned this a few times throughout the book, that formative action, that the aim of formative action, that the wider aim of education should be for students to be able to do things independently. In this chapter, you say that there are two core principles. Number one, feedback should make you think. And number two, it should have a landing space, that is, room for students to act upon it. Could you please elaborate on that? Who wants to pick that up?
Well, I think that lots of times when we organize or give feedback in education, we think as teachers, okay, this was the feedback. It's so clear now that you should act upon it. Of course, you're going to act upon it, And again, I think this is naive, because for students, it's not that clear. And also, again, self-regulation plays a part here as well. So I think it's also, again, a key factor that you think as a teacher, how can I organize in my educational process a space where students need to act upon the feedback? So the feedback needs a place to land, and just implicitly, giving feedback and expecting them, or, giving feedback and expecting them to act upon it, that's not going to happen. So what we try to incorporate and teach teachers is that you should really think this through and incorporate that in your educational program, that every time that you organize feedback, there always needs to be action. There always needs to be, a place for the feedback to land. And thinking of it in that way really helps to put that also in concrete action in your lesson series. Like, okay, if I'm organize feedback, what kind of assignment do I give afterwards? What do they need to do? Are they going to revise, or am I going to give them a new assignment? Stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, thank
so,
you.
Yeah,
Go
well,
on.
we've learned a lot, about feedback from Naomi Winstone and all her colleagues. And what she describes is the feedback graveyard. So that's where all the feedback goes that's never been read by students or has never been acted upon. And what really helped us is like thinking about these landing spaces. Like one of the ways you could view it is that feedback is information that you receive before you act upon it. And so one of the things we went through is like this entire paradigm shift on around feedback, where usually we used to think about feedback like that's something that comes from the teacher, that's something you give after the students have done something.
Yeah.
And you have like all these like ideas around feedback that were not very helpful. And like the work from Naomi Winstone and also from other people have really helped us, create like this new way of viewing feedback, which is about basically information before you do something. But it's also, we've stopped using the term giving feedback and started talking about organizing feedback, because what's very important is that somewhere along the line, feedback doesn't come from teachers anymore, but they're giving feedback to themselves, or they're giving feedback to each other, or having other sources to get feedback from. So feedback is still important, but like the entire chapter is about creating students that are independent. And what you need for independence is the capacity to actually give feedback to yourself.
Right.
So somewhere along that line where, students start off as beginners and they end up as being independent, then as a beginner, you need like positive feedback from your teacher that's very constructive, but also corrective in a way. That's really bite-sized, that keeps you motivated. And somewhere, when you take further steps, that type of feedback needs to change. And you have to be able to give yourself feedback in the end. So somewhere along that line, things need to shift. And that's usually where things go wrong, because most teachers are trained in thinking about feedback in an old paradigm. I'm the one that's supposed to give the feedback, and students are brought up in an environment where feedback is also perceived in that way. So that you as a teacher, that the teacher is supposed to give you feedback and tell you what you did wrong and what you need to improve. And what we're trying to do in this chapter, which, it's been a lot of thinking for us as well. Well, what we try to do is we try to set up feedback in a way where you think about, where do my students need to think about, and what is the space where they can act upon that thinking. So, and what you try to do from beginner to independent is you still always keep an eye on, what do they have to think about themselves? What kind of thinking do I need to do for them? But in the end, you just want them to think for themselves and come up with actions. So so that's basically like the premise of the entire chapter. And it's also very important in our entire design view on formative action, is that you also need to think about the roles that you have. And that's as I mentioned, that's also the hard part, because, when students are kind of have the habit of just receiving feedback and not doing anything with them, and you try to adopt a new way of you organizing feedback where they have to think for themselves and then acting upon it, then sometimes they'll start complaining and say, yeah, well, but that's your job as a teacher to do all that thinking for me. So that's actually very interesting, because that's something that you see from primary education to higher education, is where students will have that take up that, like, sort of resist the role that they need to have in effective feedback.
Yeah. Interesting. It seems like there's another linguistic problem here. Hey, that like feedback, it's like something that you say that you do after the event, like you've been in a restaurant, give some feedback on the quality of service or whatever.
Yeah,
and
true. Yeah,
go on.
because in the theory around feedback, you have like three terms, which is feedback, feed up, and feed forward.
Yeah,
We don't use those terms because we find them very confusing. And
yeah, you're not
also
the only
good,
one.
yeah, and also good feedback usually like uses all three of those aspects. So yeah, so basically when people talk, like regular people talk about feedback, they usually mean all three of those things. And one of the things that David Boude, who's a researcher, wrote about is that he said, well, if it's not feed forward, it's not good feedback. So we should just call everything good feedback. Yeah. Yeah.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
And also feed forward is just a horrible word, isn't it? There's just something that I don't know, it's a bit icky. So there's two, you start this chapter by talking about two misconceptions. Let's just briefly address these. You say that there are two major misconceptions when it comes to the role of feedback in formative action. The first is that the teacher should always provide students with individual, personalized, specific, and complete feedback during the process of formative action. And the second is that forms of feedback that are not those things, that are not individual, personalized, specific, and complete, and so on, or that are not provided by the teacher, are somehow of lesser quality and or usefulness. So let's nail these two misconceptions. What is wrong with these ideas? Let's take the first one first, that the teacher should provide this sort of very comprehensive feedback on what's going on. Why is this not correct?
Well, I think, of course, student or teacher-led feedback can be quite effective, but it's not the most effective form there is. Peer feedback and even feedback to yourself through reflecting on the criteria or the work of David Nichols, also very interesting that he uses like other sources, other stuff that you need to compare yourself towards, like to again organize feedback. So I think, like René already said, that we believe that there needs to be a paradigm shift, that it's not only the teacher who needs to be the one who gives individualized, very specific feedback, because that is, in that way, you create again a very passive student, because feedback then is for free. You don't have to pay. You don't have to do any effort for it. It's presented to you on a silver plate, and you only have to receive it. But again, in the work of Naomi Winstone, the whole concept of what makes feedback actually effective is that if you have to pay, if you have to do the work, if it's not for free, if you need to struggle a bit or need to think really hard. I remember so well, I was doing my master's and the teacher did a whole group feedback on our paper, on our research paper. And I remember being so frustrated because she took like one or two examples of all my fellow students, and she talked through the examples and she put them on the board and she gave like whole group feedback. And I was really frustrated getting my own paper there again on my laptop and thinking, why didn't she pick me? And now I have to make this transfer of the stuff that she just said of the whole group to my own work. And I was thinking so hard and working so hard to make the transfer. And like 2 years, 3 years later, I could still remember that moment because it was such an impactful moment for me. And then I remembered, oh my gosh, it was actually a whole group feedback. And yes, she gave the feedback, but it was not individualized. It was not very specific. And I needed to do the work, but it was really effective.
Right. Thank you. Absolutely. Do you have anything to add there, René?
Yeah, so I think like the first example of what is wrong is that you leave actually no thinking for your students. Like if you do all the thinking and you say, well, this is everything you need to improve,
Right.
then there's no thinking left. And because you're not thinking, you're not remembering. And then in the end, that doesn't lead to more independence.
Yeah. And it's sort of overwhelming as well, right? That like, there's something in this idea of just giving people one thing to work on at a time. you might have an eye on the big picture, but you don't need to say everything that there is to do to say at any one time. Right, absolutely. Okay, finally, let's just briefly touch on chapter 4, from design to instrument, and this is the strapline of the book, isn't it? Or was it? What's the strapline of the book?
Yeah.
It
It's
is.
the other way around. Yeah. So
From
the chapter
instrument
4 is from design to instrument, and the subtitle of the book is from instrument to design.
Okay, so let's explain that. Why have you reversed that in chapter 4?
Yeah, so for the book, it's like for the subtitle, it says from instrument to design, because that clarifies that we moved in our thinking from thinking about instruments and like stuff you do, activities in your classroom, towards having a more design approach, like thinking about the main goals and what pictures those instruments have a place in. And then in chapter 4, we sort of reverse that to show how you can go from a design to actual activities in your lesson.
I see, and this follows a form of backward design. Hey, like the process that you outline in this chapter, and it's interesting because it's kind of an expanded version. I often talk about backward design in my work on implementation, drawing on the work of Wiggins and McTighe, and they sort of talk about it as a 3-step process, essentially starting with an impact goal, like what is the difference that you want to make, for whom and by when. So you have this very sort of laser focused goal as to what it is that you're trying to achieve. Then the second step is to think, well, what evidence do we need to collect in order to determine whether or not we've met that goal? And then thirdly, you think, what do we actually need to do in order to amass the evidence that we've met our goal? And that might be, what do we need to do more of, do less of, do differently, and so on. And you've sort of exploded that first step out, or rather the last step of backward design, the bit where you're actually planning what to do, into a number of things, into plan a pedagogical roadmap, create a plan for knowledge acquisition, prepare or plan formative action, and design the feedback processes. So there's this very sort of front-loaded model that you're suggesting, that is, you do all of your thinking at the outset, essentially. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. So we love the work of Wiggins and McTighe. It's like a phenomenal book. I also read all the books that came afterwards, like creating high quality units, etc.
Yeah.
I think like the first phase or the second phase, first is about thinking about main goals and thinking about the assessment that you want to use. Those are very powerful steps, and they have very good examples. But one of the interesting things is that McTighe recently also started writing about making a curriculum map or something, which is also something that we were experimenting with.
Right.
So what we do is basically how the design process is set up. First, you think of the main goal, like what should students do independently, or should be able to do independently at the end of a unit. And then you start thinking back to, okay, so what are all the learning objectives underneath? And you make up a huge list. You think of the assessment. So you try to get a lot of focus in the first 2 phases of that design process. But what we then try to do in order to really think about your formative action is we make teachers make a pedagogical roadmap. So you take all the learning objectives, all the knowledge and skills that you need in order to do something independently. And then you start to, you do it in Padlet or do it on paper or whatever. And then you think about, okay, so this skill is prior knowledge to this skill. And this skill is prior knowledge to this. So you get like a huge roadmap of interconnectedness. And basically that's the schema you want in the head of your students. So you have like this overview of everything that's in a unit or in a chapter that you want to put in the heads of your students. And then you sort of use that to navigate. So if I'm going to do a process of formative action, then I'm going to give an instruction on this. And I can see in my pedagogical roadmap that this and this is prior knowledge for that. So let me just check that if they know enough about that before we move on. And one of the interesting things is that the first, like when we developed this, I had a very hard time getting Valentina to actually make one.
Always, you rat me out every time. But it's true. I hated the project. How many months did I
It took,
stall?
well, about 4 months, something like that. Yeah.
I actually tried to give my colleague the blame because I wanted to do it with my colleague, but then he couldn't find the time. And I said to René, yeah, he doesn't have the time. I cannot make it.
So do you remember that's an interesting point. What do you think was the resistance there, Valentina?
Because it's incredibly hard to make. And it's something that you never have done before. And I wasn't the type of teacher that had already a clear concept map in his head of the subject that I was teaching. So for me, I knew that was my weak spot. But at the same time, yeah, of course, when it's your weak spot, it's really hard to start. Right. And it's a way of thinking that I didn't do before. So it was a completely new way of looking at your curriculum, looking at the goals, looking at, how are they interwoven or intertwined with each other? What are the connections between the goals? But in the end, or maybe you should say it, René, but now I love it. I actually I make all these different kinds of maps. I like to do it in the evening, even of our CPD program. I love it now, but it was a hard start.
Interesting. And this is the bit that you would say, is this where you say to create a general plan for knowledge acquisition? Is that essentially what you're mapping out there in that phase, this concept map?
Yeah, so it helps, like it like the entire exercise is interesting, especially if you're not used to that way of thinking. So what happens is, for example, when Valentina had made that, she spent a lot of time and effort into doing one, and then preparing her lessons was super easy because it just took her 5 minutes. So in a way, it was really helpful, but it also helps you get a better understanding of what happens in between. So for example, if you have like a pedagogical roadmap, and on the right you will end with the main goal, like what should students be able to do independently, and on the left side you have like all the prior knowledge from previous years or previous units. And then what happens is, when students start a new unit or a new chapter, they will have they will start off as sort of beginners in a new subject. And then you will have to do a lot of hand holding, and be very teacher-led, checking for prior knowledge, making sure the foundations are right. But when you move towards more independence, then also the character of your formative action starts to change. And then, in a way, you start thinking about, okay, so what's a good point to have sense for quality? What's a good point to have like peer feedback? What is that peer feedback going to be about? What do I still need to check on the way? And then towards the end, when you hit like the end of a unit, then you start to have what we call standard feedback processes, where you have like a multi-stepped process where you work towards independence. So basically how that works is, you have all that knowledge and skills from that unit or experiences, and you have to mold them together like to one independent skill, or maybe two independent skills. And then what happens is that also what Ron said in his work is, he said nobody can do a high quality job in one go. So you always need more attempts to get to a high quality. And so that's something that we incorporated into our our entire design process, is that we said, well, when you hit the end, and you have high expectations of your students, then you really need to give them the time to work in a couple of steps towards actually being independent in a certain skill. And that's something in Holland, at least, that's something, most teachers are very focused on covering materials. And when you've covered all the material, you test your students. And what we say is, well, maybe you covered it, and hopefully you will have done some formative action in between. But then when you reach the end, you really need to invest some time and energy into making sure the students are able to do it independently and before you give them a test. And that's really something also that's very helpful in our way of thinking, because a lot of things just come together in the entire design process, like in the ways of thinking, like the curricular thinking, but also in terms of your expectations of students. So and then when you've gone through the entire process, and you walk into your lessons, you will have a very clear picture of what it is you're trying to do and how you will try to achieve it.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Well, that's been really fascinating. Thank you for that. I think that you've done a really good job of refreshing this idea that I've known about for many years, and that has always been fairly sort of problematic in terms of actually, thinking about what this looks like. I think that you've done a brilliant job with this book. There's this little catchphrase that sort of appears towards the end of the book, where you sort of say that formative assessment is proactive rather than reactive. And it seems like that's quite a nice little pithy sort of summary, essentially, of the whole approach. That it's quite front loaded. You need to do a lot of thinking at the outset, write some concept maps, spend some time talking with colleagues, anticipating misconceptions. But then as you go through the process yourself, you're just so much better equipped to guide your students towards, mastery and success. So that's really interesting. Thank you. I'm not doing very well on my target. My impact goal is to start doing shorter episodes. I've not come anywhere near meeting that target yet. The evidence that I'm collecting is the time.
Did we do better or worse than the last episode?
I'm very unclear what step one is going to involve, and so there's a couple of questions that are under the thorny questions heading that I'd like to end by asking you. One is that, as we've talked about, this is sort of a simultaneously simple and devilishly complex idea or set of ideas to actually implement. And you mentioned a few times in the book that it takes sort of 3 to 5 years for a teacher to get good at this, and we've talked a bit about why that is and why it's so hard to implement. But there's another question which is interesting, which is that, the fact that it's hard to implement, at scale. There are some people who say that we shouldn't try to implement things that are so complicated because it's sort of, we're never going to get to the point where everybody can do this effortlessly. We can't get to the point where the teaching profession can achieve mastery in terms of formative assessment, because it's so hard to do, and because there's lots of sort of other factors, right? There's lots of staff turnover, there are political changes, there's people just move jobs, they move careers, they move to a different school, and for various reasons we're always sort of reinventing the wheel to some extent. What would you say to that criticism, that because this isn't easy to do, therefore we shouldn't do it? Let's go to Valentina with that question.
Well, I think the whole reasoning is flawed. I think that, good things are most of the time hard. Most of the times are hard. Eating, having a healthy life is hard. It's easier to eat fast food all the time. So good teaching on effective strategies is quite challenging or quite hard, but I think it's very important to strive to, even if it's hard. I don't think that the reasoning that because it's hard, you shouldn't do it. I think that's wrong.
Okay, thank you. How about you, René?
Well, I can take a nuanced approach or a non-nuanced approach. So I think, like, if you look at it pragmatically, then you could say, maybe you have different levels in terms of what formative action should look like. And so a lot of the things that we describe in our book is like the really complex, like really expert level of doing formative action in your classroom. But I think, you know, even if you're not doing that, there's a lot of things that everybody can do. That's like really easy, like prior knowledge checks at the start of your lesson, or just doing an exit ticket, you know, as like Valentina and I did when we started. It's just checking, you know, what did they understand of this lesson? And then doing something with it. Like that's not really complicated. And I think that's a level of expectation you can have for all teachers. And then maybe have like another level of expectation for like your really good teachers, for example. So that's one way to look at it. But I think, like, if I'm less nuanced, I would say that it really depends on how you look at teachers as professionals. And for me, a teacher is somebody who like understands like the learning goals really well, who sets up the goals, you know, who can set up a program, that knows what assignments to give what students, and is really like in a way, formative action is all about meeting your students in the classroom, like not giving your lesson and then, you know, hoping things will stick, but it's actually meeting them somewhere in the middle, like, where are you guys? And this is where I am and trying to achieve, you know, and let's try to find a way to make it work as good as possible, you know. And to me, that's what being a professional is about. And I think if I'm not really sure if I'm willing to embrace another way to view the professionalism of teachers. So for me, formative action is like a very good way to actually increase the professionalism of teachers and to really, you know, give them more motivation for their job if they do it correctly. So in a, you know, so that's my take on
Thank
on the
you.
question. Yeah.
They're all good answers. Both of your answers and your answer as well, Valentina, I think are very, very compelling. I like this idea that you would have different standards for different levels of teachers. They sort of have that in Japan, right? Where like they do lesson study a lot, but they suggest that like you don't even think about doing that for the first 2 or 3 years. This is something for much more sophisticated practitioners to do. And I like that because it's recognition of how complex the task of a teacher is. And I don't think that's always fully understood in the wider world. We talked a bit, I was talking with one of your colleagues when I was over recently about the sort of teacher bashing that happens, you know, in the press. And it seems that it happens a bit in your country as well as in mine. And there's not really a widespread acknowledgement of how complex this role is of teaching. And I like this principled defense of the high ground and just say, you know, this is really hard and we shouldn't yes, I stoop to it. Thank you. Okay, I'm persuaded. And also, you're not talking about this in the abstract, are you? You've been working, how long have you been working like widely with teachers? How many teachers and schools have you worked with in Holland in the last, what has it been, 5 or 6 years since you've been doing this?
René is a number man, so René, this is your department.
No, it's like, it's crazy. So we have we run CPD, but we also do keynotes. We also do workshops at schools. Like the CPD is like our main thing that we do. We also do other kinds of sessions. And we have like in our organization Dropbox map, we have like one for all the schools we visited to and what kind of keynotes and workshops we gave there. And that list is like huge. So we're in Holland, we're like the #1 PD supplier for formative action. So we go to a lot of schools. We do a lot of in a lot of schools. We do a lot of multi-year programs and also work with school leaders and the teachers. And so yeah, we've really run some miles on the entire concept of marrying formative action and educational design. So and we feel in a way that it's the way to go. And on the other hand, what the thing that is still missing, that we feel like, especially in England, that's doing a lot better is coaching people in the classroom themselves. So what happens sometimes is that these teachers become very good at this whole design thing and then still struggle with how to do it in their classroom because of classroom management issues, or because they, the way they've set it up, or they run into mini whiteboard problems.
Mhm.
Yeah. So that's also things that can happen. But I think, yeah, it's hard to put a number on it, but yeah, it's
Yes.
thousands
Yeah.
of teachers. Yeah. Yeah.
Right, but it's a lot. Okay, thank you. And so my final question, we've sort of addressed a bit throughout this conversation, and so I'll change the question sort of briefly. So essentially, I wanted to ask you about, like, what's the relationship, as you see it, between formative action and self-regulated learning? Because we've mentioned that the aim of formative action is for student independence, but the aim is essentially for them to be able to independently, for example, write a really compelling essay about the causes of World War One. But so they can now do that thing independently, but the actual process of getting there hasn't been independent. That's been sort of quite largely led by the teacher. And so I wonder about, what are your thoughts on and you've mentioned it a couple of times, René. I think you mentioned it in particular, that there are areas within step 3 when you can lift the lid and you can give the pupils more control over how they respond to feedback and how they close the gap, how they give feedback to themselves, and so on. So you started to answer that question. So, but I wonder if you have anything to add to that. And then as a second part of this question, I know that you have this conference and a book coming out soon on self-regulated learning, on régulier, are we calling it? That's not well on my pronunciation. And so why are you interested in self-regulated learning? And is there anything in particular in the context of the Netherlands that is leading you to think this is going to be a new area for you to be exploring?
Okay, James, do you have another hour? Because I think those are wonderful questions. But actually, Hilly, René, and I wrote a blog about the connections between our model and self-regulated learning. We have to translate it in English as well. But I think
we'll translate it and put it on our Formative Action website.
Oh,
yes.
Great.
Because that is, I think, a good starting point to read more about the connection between those two concepts. And I think formative action always is related to self-regulated learning, but you can focus it, you can focus more on self-regulated learning, or you can focus more on like knowledge gaining and stuff like that. So there's a whole range of where to focus on, but I think that all the steps you can think about how much you want to be teacher-led, or how much room do you want, or how can you scaffold it more towards the student, that it's more student-led. Actually, I have a homework assignment here of a teacher that I've been coaching, and he's made this whole handout that in the beginning, all in red, is that what he's going to do. So he's first going to model the whole 5 steps in his classroom, and then afterwards it becomes more green. And every time the student has to do the green steps themselves. Right. So he's going to do a whole scaffold model of the scaffold way of the model. And every time the student has to, think about, okay, what is my next step, and how am I going to test myself, and how should I act upon that, or how am I going to interpret my own information? So I think there's lots of connection there. And also to go a bit into your question, like, is this a big topic in the Netherlands? Yes, it is very big, actually. And also in higher education, we find it really important that students become self-regulated learners, and also in how we organize education, by how much freedom the student has, how he has to collect his own feedback or ask for feedback and stuff like that. The whole all of the new innovative ways that are being implemented in higher education really have a lot to do with self-regulated learning of students. And Patrick Sins, a Dutch researcher into self-regulated learning, says it quite beautifully. He says, you cannot learn self-regulation by being, by self-regulating yourself. So the teacher always has to be there. So scaffolding needs to happen. And again, the formative action model really gives you a lot of structure and I think a lot of help and concrete ways or practical ways how you can, scaffold that program or the way that you can make your students better self-regulated learners.
I'm sold. Thank you for that. I love we use this phrase in the book, in Fear is the Mind Killer. We talked about like progressive ends through traditional means, right? And so, the idea that you're trying to help the kids to become more independent, effective learners. But the way that you do that is that you model it, you explain it, you get them to practice aspects of it, you give them feedback on that, you get them to respond to that feedback and so on. And it's a very sort of essentially a traditional model for how you teach self-regulated learning. And I can see that, as you were talking then, I could start to see how these two ideas are starting to dovetail in my mind. How about you, René? As a final word, why is it that you're thinking that you're wanting to explore this area of self-regulated learning more fully? And my understanding is that the new book, it's not just about seeing it as an aspect of formative assessment. You're sort of looking at self-regulated learning in the round as its own thing. There's almost like a second major area for exploration for your organization.
Yeah. So we wrote like with the help of a lot of contributors about self-regulated learning, and we sort of sketched the playing field, and also we have researchers but also practitioners and other professionals that use like aspects of self-regulated learning in their lessons. And I think most of the like the common theme in the book is this isn't easy but there's a lot of interest because sometimes school leaders will think that it's really easy. So in Holland, we have a situation, for example, where there's a big teacher shortage and we can't find teachers for every subject. And then sometimes board members will say, from board members from schools, they will say, well, self-regulated learning is like a good solution to the problem that we don't have enough teachers. And they will see it as a quick fix. But, one of the things that you've shown is that you need teachers to teach them how to do self-regulated learning. So if you have less teachers, then, that's not really going to work. So it's not like a quick fix, and that's a lot. But I think one of the main reasons that we see a growing interest is that after COVID, we've seen a lot of demotivated students, not just in primary or in secondary education, but also in higher education, where they don't show up, they don't do their work, they stay at home, and I do feel in a lot of ways is that learning more about how self-regulated learning works and how you can teach your students to do more self-regulation can help in those situations. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad move, but in a way, if we see it as a quick fix, then then you're going to run into trouble sooner than later.
Yeah, absolutely. And am I right in thinking that there's quite a few secondary schools in your country that have started to create, because of the teacher shortage, that there are now just like free periods, right, where the students can just do self-regulated learning or self-directed learning? Is that true? That's what's happening. I seem to remember you wrote a blog about that.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, they're called flex hours or something like that.
Flexi hours, yeah, and I think it's like it's a good idea on paper if you've taught the kids how to manage that time, how to hold themselves in that unstructured space. Then it could be a wonderful thing. It's a great idea to have more time for them to do that. But in the absence of that sort of prior instruction, then I predict that there's going to be lots of floundering and lots of, playing games on computers and things that are not related to self-regulated learning.
Yeah. So I think the main misconception around this is that if you use the Daisy and Ryan model for motivation, is that a lot of people will just say, well, if we give them autonomy, they will be more motivated. And yeah, that's like so not true. But they will make it their entire school concept and then say, well, but the children aren't motivated. What happened? We gave them a lot of autonomy and they're just playing computer games. So, and like, you need to have, in my mind, you need to have a really good theory of action. Like, all right, we give them more independence, if we give them more autonomy, but how is that going to work to make them more motivated? And what should we do in that process to actually make sure we get that end result? And that's a level of thinking that, you don't usually see in schools that adopt this kind of, approach.
Yeah, absolutely. How interesting. Well, thank you both. I think we definitely do need more, like at least an hour or two to explore that topic more fully. And I'm very excited about that to know that you are approaching self-regulated learning with if you can do for this field what you've done for formative assessment and translate these ideas into workable, scalable tools and ideas and frameworks for teachers to use to teach kids how to become more effective, independent, self-regulated learners. I'm very excited to see what you come up with, and to hear what the other contributors to this book have to say. I don't know if there's an English translation planned, is there, of the regular book?
No, not in this way. No, because we have a lot of Dutch contributors and there's a lot about like the Dutch setting.
Right.
Okay. But there will be a free PDF of the book online. And if people want to, grab some bits out of it and, have ChatGPT translated for them, then they're free to do so. But yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
I'll have to settle for that for now.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you both hugely for sharing quite a lot of your afternoon, not as billed. That's been such an interesting conversation. I feel like I've learned a lot. I've got a lot to think about. There's lots to take away from this in terms of my own work around implementation and around self-regulated learning. So thank you very much.
Thank you
so much,
for
James.
having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us. You're such an inspiration to us. So it's wonderful to be on your podcast. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
That's very kind. Bedankt.